An imposing building in England with an extraordinary medical past.
Inside, it's like stepping into another world. Above, you have what's clearly a medical facility, but down below it, things change. This clearly was somewhere that was incredibly important.
A mighty, rusting complex in the USA that found itself at the heart of the civil rights movement.
It's like you've been shrunk down and put into the inside of a car, because you're just surrounded by towering pipes and chimneys and chambers.
The Caribbean paradise with a long-forgotten dark past.
This industry is going to change the social and economic fabric of the West.
And a Mediterranean island with crumbling buildings and a labyrinth of underground tunnels.
This is a full-on ghost town, or probably more accurately, a ghost island.
Decaying relics and ruins of lost worlds. They were shaped by the passing years and are now haunted by the past. Their secrets are waiting to be revealed. On the shore of the English Channel to the south of the United Kingdom stands a grand old structure.
Looking at the style of the architecture, it's clearly several hundred years old, and from the scale, a vast amount of money went into this.
It appears to be grand and palatial at first, but it seems to be disguising something from its past.
When you enter, contrasting scenes appear.
Upstairs, you have what's clearly a medical facility. Then when you go down into the basement of the building, things change. It's dark down here. The rooms are small. There are bars on the windows. The contrast between the upstairs and the downstairs is really incongruous.
When you find out what was going on here, you realize that this place changed dramatically over time. But the moment it really shone was during the Second World War, when it was suddenly called into action and given an incredible responsibility.
So, what was this place? And how did it come into its own during the 20th century? Beyond the wall in the southwest corner of the grounds is an empty area of grassland. On the surface, it reveals little, but it actually holds a clue to the real nature of this place. Eric Burbeck, a local historian, has spent years researching the story here.
Beneath my feet, there lies thousands of bodies. It is said that there's over 20,000 bodies here.
An archaeological dig in 2005 revealed details of the burial practices here centuries ago.
We can see that some of them lost limbs. Some of them were twisted by disease, by syphilis, and some of these people died in ways we can only imagine.
The factor is that they're not just one level, they're buried on top of each other. We actually found a series of coffins where there were 5 bodies virtually collapsed on top of each other.
The human remains hold the key to understanding what these buildings once were.
Buried here were all sorts. Women and children, even a number of Russian bodies. And that tells you something. But the real clue is that the vast majority of this mass of bodies were British servicemen.
This is the Royal Hospital Haslar, a naval facility which was completed in 1762.
When it was built, it was absolutely enormous. The largest brick building anywhere in Europe. And that scale gives you an idea of the desperate need for something like this at the time.
Almost everything in the Royal Navy was powered by humans. If people were needed to power the fleet, then there had to be a place to fix people when they were broken or when they were sick.
But all around the place are features that suggest it wasn't an ordinary hospital for ordinary patients.
It's the kind of place that feels like it's a very good defensive position, but actually that also makes it incredibly useful for keeping people in. There's water on 3 sides, which stops people from leaving it. There are also watchtowers all round it.
The Royal Navy was filled with people who were conscripted, and it wasn't a draft that brought them into the Royal Navy. It was 5 guys and some sticks who would go out, hit them over the head, and drag them onto His Majesty's ships.
It was known as press ganging. For those desperate to escape life at sea, the best opportunity was to be found back on shore.
Escape attempts were common. They'd crawl through the sewers, climb the fences, try and smuggle their way out. Every possible exit would have been tested out by those desperate to escape this place and escape from the Navy.
But for most new arrivals, escape was a forlorn hope. Survival was the priority.
There's even a very famous phrase that is supposed to have come from this place. The way people were brought in is they were rowed up a creek into the building. And if they didn't have a paddle and they were the ones who were being brought here, they were clearly in a bad way. They were up the creek without a paddle.
Just a few decades after the hospital opened, the bloody battles of the Napoleonic Wars, which included Trafalgar and Waterloo, came to stretch the Royal Navy to its limits. Injured sailors were no longer arriving here slowly along the creek, but in their droves directly from the docks.
When casualties arrived in great numbers, they would be brought into here and they would just literally occupy the space on the stone flags. They would be propped up against the wall, some lying, and obviously some in great pain and groaning. In fact, we have written evidence of the fact that on one day alone, there were some 88 bodies wanting burial, as well as the casualties who were here. It must have been absolute bedlam.
People were wounded by cannonball that could take off a leg. They were wounded by huge razor-sharp chunks of wood blown off the side of ships. There was blood, there was sick, there were guts, and it was all a harsh, difficult place to be.
At the time, there was no triage system in place. No matter how severe your injury, treatment was on a first-come, first-served basis.
And here we have the receiving room, where as a casualty you would be lifted off the flagstones and brought in, assessed by the surgeon, hospital mate. Treatment here in those days was quite brutal, actually. Amputation, treating major wounds, fractures and such like. No anesthetic, and not even a tot of rum.
For those poor souls who were taken to Haslar, survival was far from guaranteed. Over the next century, the sick and injured continued to come here. Yet Haslar was to go through an extraordinary transformation, which would see it play a part in one of the most ambitious top-secret campaigns in history. During the Second World War, staff at the Royal Hospital Haslar received a strange directive from the authorities. It said that every patient had to leave.
All of a sudden, the wards became empty and it had a strange atmosphere. Many of the staff report about being sort of almost eerie, that there was no patients on the wards, and yet all the staff were beginning to gather for they did not know what.
To add to the unnerving atmosphere, in nearby Portsmouth Harbour, huge numbers of ships and troops were gathering. An event like no other was about to take place.
This was part of the build-up for the Normandy landings. D-Day, Operation Overlord, the most important military mission of the Second World War.
On June the 6th, 1944, more than 150,000 men landed on the shores of northern France.
Allied planners for D-Day expected 50% of the people who hit the beach to be killed or wounded. The ones who were wounded would have to be pulled right back across the channel to be looked after and patched up.
For those fortunate enough to survive that day, many of them wound up passing through the doors of Haslar. Thankfully, by that stage, the medical standards were infinitely better than when this place first opened.
This is the cellar area that was designated for use as operating theatres, and there were 3 tables here, one there, and one there, so that they could undertake 3 operations all at the same time and therefore clear more casualties.
A second operating theatre was established nearby, and the staff here worked around the clock in 8-hour shifts, often in stifling conditions.
They were very fortunate in having Haslar because of its design and build with secure cellars like this that are very thick-walled. They were safe, and the factor is that they could undertake the work, and the casualties were operated on, treated, cared for, and as soon as they showed signs of recovery, they were moved on by ambulance train.
Letters of thanks poured in.
Militaries need to look after their people, and this place was appreciated. People wrote about it in letters. People were impressed at the quality of the treatment that they received at a time when it really mattered to them.
The hospital continued serving the Navy right through the 20th century, including taking in casualties from the Falklands War. Then, in the 90s, it opened its doors to the injured of the rest of the military as well.
But most of what remains here comes from Haslar's final days, when it was in the care of the UK's National Health Service.
In 2007, Haslar Hospital was taken over by the NHS, ending 254 years of continuous military service. Just 2 years later, it closed its doors for good.
Today, the old hospital site is being redeveloped into a residential area, and those historic buildings are at the center of the project.
I worked and served here for over 55 years. I have a great love for this building, like many of my friends and colleagues who worked here. Haslar is still here. It is Haslar, always will be Haslar. It may be in a new guise, in the fact of a new community. I have every belief that Haslar will still be here in 100, 150 years' time.
In the southern US state of Alabama, in the modern city of Birmingham, there's a collection of rusting ruins.
One thing that just strikes you immediately, the thing that hits the eye, are these huge towers that just sort of come up out of the landscape.
As you move into the site, you start to be covered by all of the metalwork. It's like a giant set that you're climbing into and walking through.
It's a huge spider's web of rusting metal. You've got chimneys jutting up. You've got pipes and flywheels, your cogs, your hoists, all kinds of beautiful machinery. And then you've got tunnels, and you've got water towers, you've got trains, you've got your locomotives. This place was seriously on the industrial scale.
Unlikely as it may seem, this extraordinary place was at the heart of both an industrial and a social revolution.
When you sort of look down from above, you see this junction for railroads. Even today, you can imagine this is a real key as to what made this place successful.
This is an emblem of a pivotal moment in history and the birthplace of a revolution.
Finding of these space lays the groundwork for the sort of political mobilization that came out of churches and schools.
This impressive place was basically reborn out of the ashes of a brutal conflict, and it comes to represent the rebirth of a nation.
It all dates to a time when America was clawing itself back from the horrors of the Civil War. William T. Sherman, a prominent Union general, was a ruthless commander who pursued a scorched earth policy that left a trail of destruction in its wake.
General Sherman marches through the South, destroying everything, agricultural buildings, but also the rudiments of industrial buildings that are starting to appear in the South.
With its fledgling industries totally crippled, the southern states had to rebuild. From the ashes of the American Civil War, a new movement was born, one that would rejuvenate decimated states like Alabama. Historian Tyler Malugani has spent many years investigating the story.
So basically, nothing was here before the Civil War or even during the Civil War. Birmingham didn't begin until 1871. And that's when we see the growth of the New South movement, bringing industry to the South so the South never again would have to rely on northern goods coming down. We can make our own stuff right here in Birmingham.
The area around Birmingham offered something unique, and it was perfect for making iron.
The location of this place was just absolutely perfect because of just how cheaply they could make the iron. Within a 30-mile radius, you could get the 3 components that you need to make iron. So you've got your iron ore, your limestone, and your coal, and it's one of the only places in the world where you can find all 3 so close together.
Natural resources were one thing, but what was also needed was a method of transportation.
Now, of course, we can make all the iron in the world, but if we couldn't transport that iron, it was useless. And that's where we're right next to this railroad that's behind me. Without railroads, Birmingham never would have been possible. It's the first industrial city built in the United States, not next to a body of water, just because of the railroads.
Colonel James Wither Sloss was an important figure in bringing the railroad to the area. And that was not all. In 1882, the Sloss furnaces were born.
What we're on right now is called a blast furnace. This is really what we use to make the iron. The Sloss Furnace Company quickly became one of the largest pig iron producing companies in the world.
The process of making pig iron is both complex and dangerous.
The cool thing about this spot is we can see a lot that goes into actually making the iron. It's a lot more than just a blast furnace.
Huge towers created hot air that was blasted into the furnace to bring the temperature up to more than 2,000 degrees Celsius.
Now, the water tower is also really important. Without water, we couldn't cool the furnace to help keep it from melting down and make the steam that helped power the site.
When in operation, this place would have dominated the skyline. You've got this iron running off, and it is glowing. It's so hot. This entire network would be glowing, and it doesn't stop. It is going 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
To keep this powerhouse running required many, many workers. And one of the buildings provides a clue about the makeup of the workforce.
This building is the old black bathhouse. So this is where the black workers would have to shower after their shifts because, of course, this is in the middle of Birmingham, right in the middle of segregation. And Sloss was no different.
Sloss could entice workers, black workers, to work for very little pay by providing housing, by providing things that supported communities, churches and other buildings, other community centers, education. And so it could do things that could sort of pull people in to work for them for little pay, again, in a landscape when there aren't many options.
A lot of them were either ex-slaves or children of ex-slaves at the very beginning. So being able to provide an education for their children was a very, very big part of why they came to live here and why they came to work at a site like this.
Over 70% of the workforce was black and mainly housed in small cottages in a community that became known as the Sloss Quarters. But like much of America at that time, segregation was heavily enforced. The company operated a strict hierarchy. At the top was an all-white group of managers, chemists, accountants, and engineers. At the bottom, an all-black labor gang.
The segregation that's happening at Sloss is part of a larger fabric in which so many things are segregated, and you don't necessarily need signs. They're segregated by custom.
At Sloss, whites and blacks bathed in separate bathhouses, punched in separate time clocks, and attended separate company picnics. It wasn't just the workplace that was segregated, but the entire city. And it was all coming to a head.
They had this police commissioner, Eugene Bull Connor, who was very, very repressive and was brutal in a city that had a particularly rigid regime of segregation, that had a history of violence, so much so it was known as Birmingham.
The city became notorious for its discrimination. Yet ironically, the policies of companies like Sloss had an unintentional effect.
The funny thing is because of the schools and the churches that were found all over in these industrial housing communities, these companies not only were trying to perpetuate segregation, but subconsciously they were accidentally giving people an outlet to rise up and have a better opportunity at life through schooling and churches.
By providing schools, churches, houses that are proximate to the facility, that are spaces where African American people can commune, that's something that is absolutely vital for sort of building up grassroots networks and lays the groundwork for the sort of political mobilization that came out of churches and schools.
In 1963, tensions finally reached boiling point, and Birmingham became the focus of international attention.
Martin Luther King went to Birmingham in part because segregation was so rigid there, and the city's regime was particularly virulent against blacks. So King goes there to draw attention, to also to desegregate the city, and it leads to this children's crusade against segregation and racism in the city that brings in thousands of children who march and who are then seized upon by dogs and water hoses in a way that is incredibly brutal, that brings domestic and international attention.
The seismic events in Birmingham, Alabama helped bring about desegregation in America, which, in theory at least, deeply affected companies like Sloss.
Once the workforce becomes desegregated, everyone has, at least on paper, an equal opportunity. African Americans now can apply for higher positions where before they weren't allowed to. So desegregation was a big part of the history of Sloss in that sense.
In practice, however, while mid-level positions did open up, black workers were largely restricted to helper roles. And by the time major changes in employment law came in the 1970s, it was all too late. The era of massive plant shutdowns had begun, and it was already costing many jobs. New environmental challenges and a turn towards plastics meant that in 1971, the end finally came. Today, the furnaces lie abandoned, outdated, and too dangerous to be reused. But overlooking Birmingham, the towers still stand as lasting reminders of the people who helped build Sloss.
I think the preservation of Sloss is important not only as a record to the way in which the South rebuilt itself after the Civil War, but also it's a really important part of a fabric of not only civil rights history, but the history of black workers in the South.
Off the coast of Albania, there's a mysterious tiny island with a fascinating history.
As you approach, it's your typical Mediterranean Adriatic island. It's covered here and there with pines and olive groves and has nice little beaches visible from a distance.
As you get closer, you start noticing that the whole island is studded by little concrete structures, and it's not just one or two, it's hundreds, maybe thousands.
But in amongst these little pockets of concrete, more serious and substantial constructions emerge.
It's only once you're on the island that the extent of it all becomes clear.
Old beds, discarded kitchen utensils, abandoned schools.
All in a real state of ruin and decay, and it makes you wonder, was it just a passage of time that did for these buildings, or were they destroyed in some kind of a military conflict?
This all suggests a significant population once lived here, and they weren't just passing through either. This is a full-on ghost town, or probably more accurately, a ghost island.
There are also mysterious underground tunnels.
Lying on the ground, you come across these gas masks. So it appears they might have been preparing for some kind of nuclear or chemical attack. And some of these gas masks are tiny, like they were designed for children.
So, what is this place? And who or what were the islanders so afraid of?
When you look at a map, you see why this island was so strategically important. At the southern end of the Adriatic Sea, it narrows down to a narrow strait that's kind of a choke point from which you can control the shipping going in and out of that area. So whoever controlled this island effectively controlled the Adriatic.
Albania has a really interesting history. It was only created in 1913, and it was created by diplomatic agreement because the great powers couldn't decide, does Serbia get Albania? Does Austria-Hungary get Albania? Do the Turks keep Albania? Nobody could agree, so they said, we're going to create this new country, Albania.
The problem was that neighboring countries never really accepted Albania as an independent state.
So the Italians begin encroaching on this new state of Albania already in 1914 in the outbreak of World War I. And they expand their presence in Albania during the war. And then after the war, in the interwar period, they take over Albania altogether.
Some of the original buildings still display an Italian influence. But the occupation by the Italian fascists was just the beginning. From the peace that came after World War II, a new political force emerged to take over this place, Sazan Island. From a distance, it's a Mediterranean paradise. Yet Naim Muho recalls a time where living here was a serious business.
At the time, they called the island the guardian of war and protector of the country. They said that the island was not only responsible for protecting itself with its inhabitants, but to report to Albania the arrival of the enemy.
But who were the enemy?
After World War II, Albania was controlled by a communist dictatorship that was very friendly to the Soviet Union. The Soviets poured enormous military resources into this island. They built a port for servicing submarines. They built this extensive array of tunnels, thousands of bunkers, and an airfield. You can almost say they converted it into something like a stationary aircraft carrier.
At the heart of the regime was Enver Hoxha, the Albanian dictator. And though he was an ally of the communist superpowers, he knew they could turn on him and take over Albania at any time.
Over time, Albania asserted more control over the island. The Russians left, but the Albanian dictatorship was extremely paranoid.
Enver Hoxha fears American aggression, fears Soviet aggression, fears Chinese aggression as well. And that paranoia is rendered real and palpable by all of these pillboxes everywhere. I mean, they are all over this island. Hoxha saw enemies around every corner.
So they saw this island as their first line of defense from any future invasion.
Despite all this, the island was home, and Commander Muho has fond memories of living here with his wife and daughters, at least for a time.
This was an amazing villa. It's a pity to see it ruined now. Here, I also hosted important and powerful people whom I respected and who respected me. I keep very beautiful memories of my home.
More than 3,000 soldiers and their families lived on the island, and a whole community was born.
The building that is in front of us was the home of the former soldiers, where very beautiful cultural and artistic activities were also carried out. At the top, there is a cinema that screened about 3 films a week.
But the threat of attack was ever present, and the protection of the island people was paramount.
A marvelous work of fortification of this strategic structure was done. All weapons, equipment, and material resources had to be hidden underground, so that in wartime everything was tunneled. I'm talking about kindergartens, schools, and the elderly who took care of children during the war. This area you see now was divided into rooms. There were the dormitories, the kitchen, the canteen, the warehouse, the classrooms. There was everything.
Some believe that the tunnels had a darker purpose that was born of dangers much closer to home.
There are also allegations that it was used as a location to build chemical weapons.
Chemical weapons being the weapon of choice for a regime that's facing extinction, it might use these weapons to hold off that final enemy offensive.
While the islanders feared attack or invasion, there were also terrible dangers closer to home.
Hoxha, as so many dictators before him had done, gradually became obsessed strictly with preserving his own power and knew that if he loosened his grip at all, the public would rise up against him and he would probably be killed.
This paranoia came to a head in the 1970s. Hoxha, fearing a coup from within his own government, went on a killing spree of leading officials.
You can still see the villa of the communist defense minister, but he was executed as a traitor by the ever more paranoid dictator Enver Hoxha in 1974.
As a close ally of the defense minister, Commander Muho suddenly found himself in great danger.
After the defense minister was purged, you can imagine that anyone close to him, including the commander of Sazan, would be very understandably paranoid that they might be next.
In 1985, Commander Muho was arrested and imprisoned, accused of being an enemy of the fatherland. It was not until 1989 that he tasted freedom once more. He was freed just in time to see the collapse of the last communist state in Europe. Much of the damage here is from recent training exercises involving British Marines and the Albanian Navy. But the island is no longer the sole preserve of the military.
Sazan is a really fascinating place for tourists to visit, so they have opened up the island to tours for people who want to see all of this military history up close.
Beautiful St. John in the US Virgin Islands. On the north coast of this lovely Caribbean haven is a collection of strange-looking remains.
The beach is pristine. It's a tropical paradise. But then you go farther inland and you get to this overgrown jungle.
Almost hidden amongst the palm fronds and the vines are a series of stone walls with windows and doorways. This isn't just a palatial house. This is something far more complex.
Given that there's this chimney and there are channels, you then start to wonder if it's an industrial building.
Was this once an industrial site? And what exactly is this large flat circle of stone?
Such an exact round shape suggests a specific process, but it's not clear what that process is.
A short distance away, near the water's edge, another ruin towers over the landscape.
There's a huge stone building that's on the mountainside, and it doesn't seem connected at all.
Both buildings are in the same stone style and with a specific design, but it's not quite clear what the linkage between the two sites was.
So what were these used for? And is this damage a clue as to why these buildings have just been left to crumble into the jungle?
The history of this small island is rooted in an era of exploration and a time when European countries were looking to expand their empires.
In the 17th century, the Caribbean was being divided up by European powers eager to exploit its resources. And this particular area was settled by the Danes.
The Danish explorers faced a whole host of difficulties and dangers.
There were hurricanes and earthquakes. There wasn't much fresh water on the island. Many lost their lives upon arriving here, but the risk was deemed worth it. Here, they could produce a commodity that was more valuable than gold and as addictive as a drug.
This industry is not just going to produce a lot of wealth for those who own it, it is going to change the social and economic fabric of the West. Without the wealth generated here in the Caribbean, the Industrial Revolution would have been impossible.
And so the money poured into Europe. But for others in the Caribbean, the birth of the new industry had dreadful consequences, as Park Ranger Ken Wild discovered through his analysis of the ruins.
So as you look into this small space, we think it's probably a place where they may have incarcerated somebody. It's a dungeon.
But for some, this was home. Who were the people forced to live in these conditions? And why were they here?
So the Danes didn't have any indigenous labor force, and they couldn't convince fellow Danes to come over. So instead, they turned to buying enslaved peoples from Africa.
You would have people being not only subject to an incredibly arduous, long, cramped, deadly voyage across the Atlantic, but then they would be in a situation where they would often work 18 to 20-hour days, especially during harvest.
This is the Cinnamon Bay Plantation. What was grown and processed here was sugarcane.
The sugar industry and the slave industry were intimately interlinked, and you need a large labor force to produce it economically.
Indeed, one of the reasons why there's such a high level of export of enslaved labor to the Caribbean is that people die off. It's deadly labor.
If you have 4,000 enslaved people on this island, it must have been just horrendous. And because of the punishments for any infraction were just so severe.
Sugar is a very delicate process, and you need to have workers that are completely subsumed to a heavy disciplinary system so that you can get them doing what you want them to do at the time you want it done.
The back-breaking work began in the dense fields of towering sugarcane.
Most people haven't wielded a machete and tried to cut cane, but it's one of the most difficult agricultural tasks you can imagine.
From here, it was transported to the processing site above, where the circular structure still visible today did its work.
So we're standing on top of the animal mill. You've got your rollers here, and so you have your animals going around in a circle. We find these round platforms all over the island.
4 people were needed to run the horse mill. 1 drove the animals, 2 worked the rollers, feeding the stalk back and forth, and a 4th took away the leftover sugarcane pulp, called bagasse.
The pulp was then turned into highly lucrative brown sugar. But trouble was brewing on St. John's.
So in these terrible conditions, we shouldn't be surprised that the slaves started to hatch plans for rebellion.
The Danish West India Company only employed 6 soldiers to watch over the entire island. They were vastly outnumbered. The revolt started on one plantation, Coral Bay, and then moved on to the fort.
This revolt was not only long-lasting, it was incredibly deadly and destructive. 1/3 of the white inhabitants were perhaps killed, and up to 1/2 of the plantations were destroyed.
The Danish just didn't have the manpower to fight back. Instead, they enlisted the help of French and Swiss colonialists. The insurgents held their ground, fighting a guerrilla-style war that lasted for 10 weeks. The last rebel was finally captured on the 23rd of August, 1734.
After the slave uprising was finally crushed, punishments and cruelties only worsened. It was all intended to serve as a warning to others.
But the terror tactics in the end didn't work. The Caribbean sugar industry would be plagued by rebellions right up until the abolition of slavery by the British Empire in 1834.
With slavery at last outlawed, and with increased competition from mainland Europe, the sugar industry rapidly declined. Before long, the stone buildings here were abandoned. For decades, the structures lay at the mercy of the ever-encroaching jungle, until the American government purchased the island from the Danish and preserved much of it as a national park.
This site is incredibly important. It's one of the few sites in the Americas, especially something that's now part of the United States, where we actually can go to the site of a slave revolt, one of the earliest, one of the longest, one of the largest.
Now they lie abandoned, but once they were at the cutting edge of engineering. There are echoes from history in these decaying structures. They remind us of terror and war, but also of great innovation and human endeavor.